The second half of the story is really challenging because during this time where I went a few times to church, I actually went probably 4 or 5 times and then stopped. And I stopped of my own accord, and then I got the Gospel of John. And I don't know why I stopped, actually. I just decided to stop, right? So this is between probably now January to that May period. But I just stopped because I think I had to figure this out myself. And obviously in retrospect, I figured it was God just, changing me. It wasn't me figuring things out, really. It was how God used me and worked in me. But I had stopped going to church. And so after I became Christian, now I had to restart that. And so, but the problem was I was scared of telling my parents. I didn't know what would happen. I thought I might get kicked out of my house. I had plans arranged for where I would move to, what I would pack, all of those things. I honestly did not know what was going to happen, and I was fearful for telling my parents. And this is what a Muslim, if they make this call, has to go through. And so I didn't tell them, actually. So I took the coward's way out, candidly. And I never told them, actually. What I did say was, unfortunately, it was a lie, because I said I would go to debating society every Sunday. And I figured, people do have a philosophical discussion, and so it's, very loosely the truth, although I know it's a lie. But I justified it and said, that's what it is, right? So I was too scared to tell the truth, unfortunately. And so I would go every Sunday. And I would be fearful of them finding out. Now this went on for a good number of months, and almost a year later, just under a year, I actually said, I realized God was saying to me, no, Sumair, you gotta tell your mom. And so I remember I was in the kitchen, and my mom was getting something from the cupboards, and I said, so Mom, I gotta talk to you about something. I don't talk about deep stuff with my mom. It's an Asian thing, I guess. And she said, okay. I said, and I was trying to think of how eloquently I could put it, but I just came out and said, I'm a Christian. And then the world ended, right? It was like arguments and yelling and screaming and sort of, why did you do this? Who brainwashed you? They tricked you. They just want your money. You grew up as a Muslim. You're born a Muslim. You'll always be a Muslim. You're a Pakistani Muslim. We didn't take you to Arabic school early enough. We didn't take you to Islamic school enough. We didn't have you interact with Muslim families enough. You have too many non-Muslim or non-Pakistani friends. You have too many Chinese friends. It became everything. And it became like an all-out, battle. And for me, I didn't really argue too much. I just tried to respond to each point and said, she said, why do you have to do this? And I used to just argue and say, or respond back saying, it's the truth. I can't deny the truth. I said, it's not an issue of just preference. It's not like being a vegetarian and a meat eater. It's not lifestyle. It is the choice of life. It's an absolute truth. And that was tough, for months. She would wake up, I would wake up in the morning, and before my eyes even opened, she'd be in my computer chair and lecturing me. She would guilt me by saying, she would cry and say, look what you've done to our family. Imagine your sisters, and when they get married, what's going to happen to them? She would blame my dad. She would blame herself. She would blame me. And that lasted a long time, almost a year. And that was tough, emotionally. And that was my first year of university. The unfortunate thing is, so then after that happens, this is just dragging on, and I'm going to university, and at that time, it's the only time in my life that actually I felt fear, because my concern was, what about my dad? Because my dad didn't know at this point, and that's pretty scary, right, to think about what my dad would do. I didn't know how he would react again. I had a plan of where I would move out and what I would take, and I was an IT nerd, right? So I said I'll take my desktop before we had laptops, and I'd wrap my clothes around it to protect it. The main thing was my computer. And so I had all of it planned out, right? But it was fear. It was the first and only time in my life I truly felt fear, because every time I came home from downtown Toronto when I went to U of T, I would be fearful that maybe tonight's the night that he found out, and my mom told him. And my mom never did tell him, because she wanted this to go away. She thought it was a phase, and it would go away, and she didn't want him to blow up. And then it becomes interesting, because now I feel at some point God's saying, you got to tell your dad. And so I told my mom in first year university, and then my dad, God says, you got to tell him now. This is several months later. And I'm like, okay, I got to tell him. So I start text messaging all my friends, and they're praying for me. And at this time, I'm learning actually how to drive. My dad's teaching me how to drive, and this doesn't usually go well when fathers teach their kids how to drive. And there's something that spurs an argument. right? There's an issue where he cancels a lesson and he does something for friends, and there's this constant battle between my mom and him about him choosing friends over family. And I made a comment about this, of like, this is why mom always says, like, you always cancel and bail on your family. And it causes this argument. And it's a big argument. Like, I come home with him, he's in the car, he cuts the lesson short, I hit the brakes hard, and I get into the driveway to send a message, he gets angry, I'm angry, he goes in the house, there's a lawn chair in front of the house, I remember, that was, the wind blew it over, and I was pretty angry, so actually I just decided to kick the lawn chair, because I'll just kick it up, right, to put it up, it was functional. But I used to play soccer, so actually I kicked the lawn chair and shattered it, like it shattered in half. And I remember looking up at my dad, and he was pissed, right, because he's like, this punk kid is, angry at me, and I'm angry at him, and he just broke my lawn chair. So I looked up, and I was like, oh, crap, this is not good. And I bolted, I just ran. And then I remember thinking, I was like, this makes no sense. God was telling me to tell my dad, and then I had just the most epic, biggest argument of my life with him. So that doesn't make sense. That's like waving meat in front of a lion. Why would I tell him now? And so I told my friends, okay, it's off. And I called another friend of mine and said, what do I do? And she said, who knows how God is using this? And I was like, this makes no sense. Like, I don't have to be the smartest guy in the world, but my dad's pretty angry. I shouldn't tell him now. And so actually I said, okay, maybe I'll just leave this to God and see what happens. The next morning, my dad actually left me a voice message, and he actually apologized. And now you have to understand, this is the first and only time in his entire life that he's apologized to me. So for sure I knew God was involved. And so I text messaged my friends and go, game on, we got to start praying again. I went to my dad's office and sat down with him and told him I was a Christian. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, I don't know if it works that way. I think I am. And he goes, no, you're not. He goes, you're a Muslim. And I said, again, this is truth. I can't deny truth just because of preference or people's perception. And he said, you can't go to church. And I said, I got to go to church. He said, you can't go to church. I said, I got to go to church. It was very elementary school, back and forth, right? It was like, back and forth on the simplest things. And again, it became business, right? So we cut a deal. And he was originally going to say, okay, okay, like, how about this? I won't go to church, because he wanted me to see an imam, which is the equivalent of a Christian pastor, right? I said, okay, how about this? I will give you Tuesday and Thursday nights and spend 2 hours each night with an imam. And for that duration of 6 months or whatever, I will not go to church. And he said, okay. And so I booked the deal. And at this time, I was teaching Sunday school, and so week to week, my church was praying for me, because they wouldn't know if I would end up at church. And I would never know when this booking of the imam would happen. And so every Sunday I would wake up in the morning and run to the washroom, run to my room and change, and run out of the house, because I never wanted to get caught when I called the no-fly zone, between my room and my parents' room in the washroom, because they would just hammer me with, they're brainwashing you, they just want your money and everything. And it was like an emotional onslaught and a mental onslaught. And so every week, I didn't know if I'd go to church, and every week I would run out of the house quickly, and that was how it was. And the funny thing is, by the grace of God, I don't know if God just knew I was weak and couldn't handle it then, He never called the imams, and I never had to stop going to church, ever. And that's how it stayed. And that's sort of the story of at least how I became Christian and what happens thereafter. Now, it doesn't end there, and this is important, because you have to understand, when you minister to a Muslim, like I was, it's everything, right? Now it's family, it's culture, it's nationality, it's all one big thing, politics. So it becomes more complicated. When you go to family friend's house, remember I said I had to go to people's houses and then the men would go off and pray. What happens now? I would sit in the room, and it becomes very obvious that something's wrong. This guy's not going to pray. And it has ramifications now. I just got married recently, and my father did not attend my wedding. One reason was because of this, right? He wanted me to do a Muslim ceremony. I married a Chinese Christian, and that's not right. He wanted me to do a Muslim ceremony. I said, I can't. It's not congruent with my faith. It doesn't make sense. It would be fake. It actually would be an insult to your view of God, even if you believed in the Muslim God. And he decided not to come to the wedding and left the country the week of the wedding. And so you still deal with it today. I had people who were invited to the wedding who refused to come to the wedding once they found out it was a Christian ceremony. And so it's important to understand when you minister to Muslims, or even if I share my story, it's just constant because everything's tied together. And so that's kind of just the reality of what it means for a Muslim to be called by the Father to the Son. And so I don't present that my situations are very complex. Some people in the world die for their faith and have much more difficult situations. Mine is very minor, right? It's nothing compared to what people have to put up with in terms of their lives on the line for believing in God. But I share at least what my personal experience is. What I do now in terms of where I am is by God's grace, He's given me the ability to have a lot of experiences. Teaching the youth in my church for 10, 12 years. He's given me a passion for youth and teaching in Sunday school and leading fellowships. And most recently given me a passion for apologetics. And just about 3 years ago, I formulated a website that was in the making or in my head for at least a year or two prior to it being conceived, called Theology and Sneakers. And so theologyandSneakers.com is really where I spend a lot of my time to present what's called apologetics, which comes from the Greek word apologia, which is a verbal defense. And it's giving an explanation of what we believe, why we believe it. And so what I spend a lot of my time doing, because I came from a skeptic's view, someone who was against Christianity, I understand that there has to be emotional and intellectual obstacles that we have to remove from people. As 1 Peter 3:15 says, that we have to be prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have with gentleness and respect. And so I have to give that reason. And that's my burden, right? And so that's why I need to do that. And so God's blessed me with this ministry to be able to preach at churches, preach at universities, but also have an online ministry like Theology and Sneakers to answer people's questions and let them realize that they can understand what they believe and they should understand why they believe it. And that even more importantly, that they understand that faith isn't a leap into darkness, but it's actually a step into the light illuminated by evidence. And you can have evidence, you can have science, you can have logic, you can have history, archaeology, third-party evidence, extra-biblical information. You can have all of these things back an objective worldview, and how it's not about just subjective and choosing what feels right and what feels good to you or what's the best story. It's about understanding the objective truth, because you have to base your life on that. And if you don't base it on the right view of what reality is, your whole life is wrong. And so, I'll close off a little bit of my sharing, but hopefully you get a feel for what it means for a Muslim to go from curiosity to respect to admiration to reverence. The battle they'll have to deal with after, and if you minister to a Muslim, you can provide support for them in that way. And then hopefully you can see the progression of how God can use someone who came from, remember I said, a shy kid, to someone who speaks in front of hundreds of people, who speaks every other week to churches and fellowships. He's changed my entire life. What I live my life for, my meaning of life, everything, how I spend my time, my energy, my effort, my money, where I derive my happiness, my joy, how I look at family and my wife and my devotion to my wife and my friends, all of it comes from Jesus Christ. And so I thank you for the chance to listen, for you listening and the chance to share with you. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you can reflect on how amazing God is and how He can take a sinner and a person who's as useless as me to be used as a tool for His kingdom. And again, my website's Theology and Sneakers. Feel free to visit the website. You can ask me other questions. And if you're a Muslim out there, remember, there's no one born of faith. Even in the Christian world, God doesn't have grandchildren. And so you have to figure out the faith for yourself. And I would encourage you to ask the right questions. Ask why they believe Jesus is not the Son of God. Look at the scriptures. Understand that they're translations, not versions. Understand that Jesus Himself says He is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one shall come to the Father except through Him. Understand the charge of blasphemy held against Him by the Pharisees, that He was the I Am. He took God's title. These are things that are very clear in Scripture. So for everyone out there, realize that Jesus is who He said He is. Scriptures is God's Word, and the resurrection of Christ is proven in evidence. And so research those things for yourself and come to an understanding of how great God is and how He's made it plain and known. As it says in Romans 1, that we are without excuse because even His creation testifies to His glory. Thank you very much.